It's Reconciliation Week, so we should acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we're in and recognise their more than 40,000 years of stewardship before European invasion. I'll pass this over to Jack Gilding, and he is the is with Backroads Connections. He's also involved with Tasmanian Renewable Energy Alliance. He's worked on a whole lot of renewable power schemes, and I think he's going to give us a very interesting talk. So I'll pass it over to Jack. Here we go.
Thanks, Anne. So I'll just get this up here and share my screen with you. So what I want to talk about today is basically four things. So a bit of an overview about what community renewable energy is. Hopefully that's not too boring for those of you who are very much involved in this already. But there are some interesting characteristics about community renewable energy. I've chosen out of the 100 or more projects that are operating around Australia, 4 that I think give a particular flavour of the diversity of the community renewable energy sector. Want to spend a bit of time on a checklist that we developed a few years back on what's required to launch a successful community renewable energy project, because I think that's still very relevant. And then to talk finally about the particular time that we're in and the challenges and opportunities more generally. So jumping into that, what is community renewable energy? So there's a number of different dimensions to this. I guess the most obvious one is scale. And the community renewable energy is a bit of is in between the thing that everybody's very aware of in terms of rooftop solar and now increasingly batteries as well. But that's very much at the household level. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the traditional electricity system, where a combination of either publicly owned or privately owned generators bid into a national market. And most of those are very large businesses driven, whether they want to be or not, by the need to make money. So community renewable energy is firstly different in scale from both of those two extremes, but it's also different in intent. So it has, the sector has a particular agenda that it's trying to do. So obviously decarbonisation, it's about renewable energy, but it's also about decentralised energy and democratisation. And with that comes a lot of particular sorts of projects, some of which I won't talk about at all today, trying to address some of the equity issues in the energy system. The other thing to say about the sector is the diversity of it, which is certainly a strength, but to me, and I'll come back to this a bit later on, is to some extent also a weakness, or not a weakness, but an illustration of the stage that I think we're still at. Just wanted to say a few things about what I'm not going to talk about, because within the whole renewable energy decarbonisation agenda, there's a lot of different sorts of activities, and I won't be talking about bulk buy schemes. Most of you will be aware of those. Traditionally solar panels and solar hot water services, but now seeing bulk buy schemes for batteries, domestic batteries, but also quite excitingly, I don't know if this is happening on the mainland, but certainly in Tasmania we have a business that's specifically doing bulk buys of second-hand electric vehicles, which is very exciting. Another area which is really developing at the moment is virtual power plants, and that's about having a whole range of decentralised resources that are coordinated in some way to feed into the grid and in the sense behave collectively. And then solar gardens is another model which I guess is a bit under the umbrella of community renewable energy, but it's specifically about doing renewable energy projects for low-income people or people who don't have access to rooftops or to be able to invest in solar. So the technology for community renewable energy projects, the large bulk of the projects are solar or solar and batteries. So why is that? I guess there's a bunch of reasons behind that. It's an affordable scale. So, you know, you're talking about projects in the 10 to hundreds of thousands of dollars range. And so that is a doable objective for a community group in a fundraising or a donation model or whatever. There's solar projects, particularly what we call behind the meter projects are easier to do because the regulatory environment is a lot easier, and also the economics is much more straightforward. There are some very exciting projects with other technologies. Hepburn wind, I'll talk about a little bit later. The illustration there is the turbine for the Warburton mini hydro scheme being that was renovated and is now operating. So that's a community mini hydro scheme, which is also a great little project. But you will find that if you're looking to get into this kind of area, the solar and battery projects are particularly the easiest. Diversity of funding models. So there's a whole range of ways that these projects get funded. And I'll talk about some examples of basically all of these models. So the money can just be donated, and if the beneficiary of the project is something that the community supports, a local school or a childcare centre or a community hall or whatever, then it's quite viable to have a project where the community gets together and just donates the money for the benefit of that community facility, whatever it is. No interest loans, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a sec, but there is a fantastic project that does no interest loans specifically for community energy projects. Debt, once again, in the examples, we'll come across a couple of different variations of that. And finally, equity, where the people who invest in it, part of the investment is a notion of getting a return on their investment. So typically, if it's a community renewable energy project, people aren't just doing it to make money. They're doing it because they support the project. But you know, these could be cases where people are investing quite substantial amounts of money. It might be their own self-managed super fund or whatever, or their own, you know, large amounts of their own money, and they'll be looking for some kind of equity return on their investment. Power purchase agreements is one way of managing the money flows for these projects, where the site that's hosting the panels, instead of getting the benefit of cheaper electricity, or as well as getting a benefit of cheaper electricity, pays the community group who's set up the project for the electricity that's generated on their roof, rather than them investing in the project. So big diversity of funding models. Okay, some example projects. Obviously particularly chosen a couple of Tasmanian ones. Don't apologise for the bias there. So the Headsticks project, in one sense, technologically a very straightforward project. A disability enterprise in Glenorchy in Hobart, run by St Vincent de Paul. Great little business, employs about 30 or so people with mainly intellectual disabilities, does really high quality knitwear, school uniforms and so forth. Came to approached a couple of different organisations to see if we could help them get solar panels to reduce their electricity bill. So what we did there was the first thing to do there, and this is, you know, classic typical thing you need to do in any of these projects, is to work out the economics of the project. And that involved putting in some monitoring to measure how the electricity was being used. They have a lot of three-phase knitting and embroidering machinery, but I didn't know first, you know, initially, whether that equipment was running most of the day, or whether, you know, you'd turn the machine on and it'd run for 10 minutes and then you'd stop. And so the power, but when we measured the power consumption, it was pretty consistent during the day. As you can see, they've got a nice flat roof, so everything stacked up really well. So a great project, a great source, a great organisation to have their electricity bills reduced. Nice flat roof, good demand profile. They're working 5 days a week. So the economics of that stacked up quite well. It was a $37,000 project. Because of the nature of the organisation, they had a good handle already and working with St Vincent de Paul on the groups that supported them traditionally, and so they raised quite a lot of money by direct donation. But this is where the Carina Fund came in. So the Carina Fund in South Australia, a great project that supports community renewable energy activities, lends money for free, lends money with no interest to community projects. And the other thing about that was that they underwrote the project in a sense. They said, we will lend you whatever you don't raise from your fundraising. So that really gave the project a boost to be able to do that. We borrowed $18,000 from the Carina Fund. Vicky, who's the manager at that enterprise, was very keen to pay that loan back quickly. She basically allocated all of the savings from the solar, which I think was about $9,000 a year, to paying off the fund, the loan very quickly. And so now the organisation is getting the full benefit of the savings from the solar. So that's a very cost-effective way for people to support an organisation. People have made donations. The project is now saving that organisation $8,000 or $9,000 a year, which means that you know the organisation is more viable. They can employ more people. The governance structure there wasn't a community group behind that as such. Most of the project was managed by the management committee of Tasmanian, who had all the contacts with the fundraising. So myself and some other people helped them with the writing the specification, doing the monitoring and so forth. The Newbina Project, another Tasmanian project. This one's still under development. Newbina is in the Port Arthur, Tasman Peninsula area. And there's a very active group down there called Tasman Peninsula Power. So they've been looking to do a community renewable energy project for a while. In discussion with the council, the idea came up of this community residential units, so 5 two-bedroom units that are currently being built, or are built. They're actually prefabricated units. They've been built, they've been delivered to the site. The photos there are the installation of the solar panels on the roof and the Tesla Powerwall, 4 Tesla Powerwall batteries. So this project was driven by a number of different factors. One was the enthusiasm of the group to do something in the community renewable energy space, but also an awareness of the issue of power reliability in the Tasman Peninsula. The geography of the Tasman Peninsula makes it very vulnerable to power outages and very vulnerable to being cut off, which they were in the Denali fires about 6 years ago, where the power was off for a number of days and the road was cut, and so the whole peninsula was isolated as a result of those fires. Electricity got back on quite quickly, actually. Aurora Energy, as it was at the time, got in and put in some generators. So that's and so this project is designed as a microgrid. When the power goes out, the batteries kick in, and people will still have access to lights and basic electricity. They won't have access to hot water or space heating because the batteries can't support that. But all the emergency stuff, you know, charge your phone, have the lights on, communicate, medical equipment, whatever you've got, will still operate. So the finance for this is a grant-funded project. So the Tasmanian state government gave the group a $200,000 grant, which covers the installation of the equipment, the planning of it, but also some wider research on the further options for the Tasman Peninsula. Okay, next project, Hepburn Wind. This is by far and away the biggest community renewable energy project in Australia. 2 megawatt turbines, $13.5 million. So a big project. And once again, so there you've got both the equity and the debt funding. So the majority of the funding, about $9.6 million, was investment from the community, and they've now started paying dividends, which is a fantastic milestone. And there were also some state government grants to cover some of the development work early on, and then some unexpected equipment that actually I think you can see it in the background on the right hand side there, some unexpected equipment that was needed at the last minute to condition the power in order for it to go into the grid. And then the Bendigo Bank provided a bridging loan for that. So there you have both the equity investment and once again the bank loan, you know, covering the gap, making the project viable. Lismore Sewerage Farm, great in terms of the technology. There's not a lot of floating solar farms around, but if you haven't got land and you've got a big pond, then that's an interesting way of doing solar. So quite innovative technology there. Interesting side benefit of that is that solar panels work better when they're cool. So having it mounted on water actually makes it more efficient. Interesting, the Starfish Enterprises, who put a lot of work into making this project happen, looked at a lot of different financing and governance models. The showstopper here in terms of doing an equity investment was that it is built on council land. And the council, I don't know the details of it, but the council basically wasn't comfortable with somebody else owning the infrastructure on their land or on their sewage farm. And the way that they worked around that was that but the community wanted to invest, wanted the project to happen. So what happened was they set up a special, what's called a special purpose vehicle, a limited liability company, where people put the money in and then lent it to the council. So the council borrowed the money from the community in order to do the project. Okay, so I think that's the example project. As I say, that's there are something like 100 of these projects, so that's just a flavour of some of the diversity. So challenges in Tasmania. So I've been living in Tasmania and working on various things, including community renewable energy projects, thinking that Tasmania was the ideal place to do community energy projects was one of the reasons I moved down here. So what have I found in that time? So there's a bunch of reasons why. So firstly, the reasons why it ought to be easy. It's a great place to do renewable energy projects. We've got everything. We are the most southern part of Australia, but we've still got plenty of sunshine. But there's also great wind and great hydro resources in Tasmania, also some tidal resources. So spoilt for choice in terms of the technologies that work in Tasmania, and obviously a lot of expertise in the community as a result of 100 years of running on basically renewable energy, or renewable electricity, I should say. Important to make that distinction. But with that comes possibly a bit of a perception that we've solved that already. It's kind of true in relation to electricity, but it's certainly not true in relation to carbon emissions. You will hear people saying that Tasmania's carbon neutral or carbon positive. That's very much a result of the mathematics of how you do the calculation of the forestry impact, and forestry activities have reduced, forests grow back, that sucks up carbon. So in the short term, with the current methodology, there are some arguments that we're carbon neutral, but certainly in terms of the other sectors, the transport sector, I mean, we've got no electric public transport. The industry sector, we have coal, fired industrial processes. But there is that perception that Tasmania's kind of already done it. And so unless you really understand the details of carbon footprint, you realise that there's actually a fair way to go in Tasmania in relation to the climate challenge. And it's probably fair to say that we don't have the perception of who you're fighting against in quite the same way. So although there is some coal mining, most people aren't aware of it. All of the energy entities, the generation of electricity by Hydro Tasmania, the distribution of it by TasNetworks, the retailing of it by Aurora Energy, are all government business enterprises. They're all owned by the people of Tasmania. So in that sense, there's also the perception of we're kind of quite well looked after already. So that can take away some of the motivations that in other places drive people to be more passionate about community renewable energy projects. It is a small population. I mean, there's only 500,000 people. So, although the average population of Tasmania is probably poorer than most of Australia, there are certainly pockets of quite substantial wealth. But, you know, in terms of both the ability of people to donate and the size of the population, it's a smaller pool. Technology-wise, the projects, as I said before, solar projects are easier, more straightforward, and they're certainly viable in Tasmania, particularly behind the meter. Although there are also 2 commercial solar farms under development. Now, a solar farm is harder because you only get the wholesale price of electricity, but they're obviously seen by the developers to be viable. But wind and hydro is definitely where Tasmania has the relative advantage in technologies, but those projects are harder to do. The wind projects are harder to do because you need a good site and you need, ideally a year or 2 of monitoring of wind resource in order to do the economics of a project. Hydro projects are difficult because the management of the water supply. So even if you're doing quite a small run-of-river project where you're taking the water out, generating some power, putting the water back in a couple of 100 metres downstream, you're still subject to environmental assessments and the control of Hydro Tasmania in relation to the management of water resources. So Hydro Tasmania has, as well as its main business of generating electricity, actually manages the water resources in Tasmania generally. So you have to deal with the hydro if you want to do a small hydro, even a small hydro project. Next point there, do you lobby the government or go it alone? In a sense, you can't do a project in Tasmania really without dealing with the government enterprises of one sort or another. Even a behind the meter, solar project, you've still got to usually have to negotiate tariffs. You have to negotiate an agreement with TasNetworks in relation to what you're allowed to connect to the grid. So there is a question there of, in some places people, I guess, put a lot more energy into doing the project and then dealing with who they have to deal with in terms of retailers or network providers, distribution network later down the project. I guess in Tasmania, there's both positives and negatives to this, but those government business enterprises pretty much have a very large role in the whole energy system. And then you've got the state government. Most of you will have seen, it got a lot of positive publicity, statements by our new Premier about a 200% renewable target. It's very definitely a 200% renewable electricity target, not renewable energy target. And it's predicated on being able to connect to the mainland, because there's not much point in generating twice as much electricity as you use unless you can either create a lot more demand or export it to the mainland. So that kind of vision is driven very much by really 2 things: the Marinus project, which is trying to increase the interconnection with the mainland, and the idea that we have the potential to do green hydrogen to generate new industries, but particularly hydrogen-based industries. So there's a bunch of reasons why it is in some ways harder to do community renewable energy projects in Tasmania, but also still very exciting. Okay, moving along to a bit more general. So now up front here, these dot points are very directly taken from that reference at the bottom. Short guide to starting a community renewable energy project. This is a project that a group of us worked on 6 years ago now. But I think it stands up pretty well. And it is kind of a bit sobering to look at the effort that goes into a community renewable energy project. So just running through these things, through the dot points there, there is quite a range of expertise you need. So obviously you need to engage your community, you need to understand the technology, you need to understand the financial structures, you need to understand the quite strict rules in Australia about raising money from the public, and you need to understand governance structures. And typically the community renewable energy projects that have done this successfully have a core group who can cover all those skills. And ideally you'd want somebody with a bit of expertise in each of those areas, a bunch of people who get on and are prepared to work together to work out the project. And then if it's a community project, you need to engage your community. You need to talk to the community about what they want to do, what they see as the problem that you're trying to solve. Is it reducing your carbon footprint? Is it dealing with equity issues? Is it being more self-sufficient at a community level rather than depending on a big centralised grid? And you need to choose a technology, and then sort of coming out of that is a vision and a technology. So what's the driving force behind your project, and what's the thing that you want to do technically. And then there is a lot of detail. Sometimes you can just get a quote from a solar supplier, but even before you do that, you'll need to have a good idea of the site, the power consumption and so forth. If it's a wind or a hydro project, then as I said before, there's quite a lot more things that you have to detail research you have to do. And you have to have a business model. The behind the meter solar, the business model is relatively straightforward. You invest in the solar panels, you produce more of the electricity that you're using yourself or the host site is using, and that saves you money. And then you've got to decide how that benefit gets divvied up. Does it get paid back to investors? Does it benefit the host organisation? Is it paying back a loan versus paying a dividend to investors? And then obviously, best vision in the world, then you've got to make it happen. And there's a lot of stuff you have to do there in relation to dealing with retailers, network providers, solar installers, or whatever the technology you're using it is. And I guess one of the lessons that we looked at, one of the things that we talked about when we produced this list, which is the 4-page guide. I mean, that's part of that guide to starting community renewable energy projects, much more comprehensive, but up the front there's a 4-page guide, which I really recommend people read as a first step. And I guess on that we finish on the point of it's a long journey. It's several years of slog. Newbina Project, we've been working on that for a couple of years. It's still not operational, and that's Hepburn Wind, a bigger project, a longer time scale again. Even the projects like that Warburton mini hydro project, a number of years, a number of setbacks before it finally happened. So make sure you have fun doing it, that that the community gets, that people doing it get some enjoyment out of it, the community engages and learns things out of that process, because it's going to be a couple of years before you've got, in most cases, before you've got some something to show physically. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour for what's involved in a community renewable energy project, and particularly some of the differences about Tasmania compared with the mainland. So I guess trying to, and not wanting to downplay that it is a big long slog, but trying to finish on a more positive framing of the whole thing. So I guess we're all in a strange space at the moment with just the fact that we're doing this as a webinar rather than a meeting in a pub in Hobart, and so we're all doing new things. But as part of that, I guess there's a general acceptance that old models haven't worked, and that we can do things differently, and that even a conservative government can do things quite differently. And I think also a perception that after what people have been through and are going through, I'm a bit defensive about putting post-COVID-19 there, because we're certainly not post-COVID-19 yet. But there is that kind of sense of the world has opened up. You know, things are changing very rapidly, not always for the best. In fact, you know, in a lot of ways, quite scary developments. But also a perception of the future challenges of climate change. Our approach to that will be conditioned by what we've learned of what we're capable of doing as a society in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The other thing to say, I guess, is that the people in the electricity system itself, it's a big monster of a regulatory, legal, financial environment. I mean, I haven't worked in a lot of other sectors, but the only thing that I think comes close to it in terms of complexity and governance and just different interest groups is possibly the health system. But the electricity system is unbelievably complicated and has a lot of players in it. And like any aspect of human political organisation, you know, there are a lot of conflicting interests. But there is also a general awareness in the electricity system that things are changing and need to change and will change. And so, and there's basically listed there 3 particular things that are happening at the moment. So regulatory sandbox, this is a bit of bureaucratic jargon, but what it means is that even the AEMC, which is the body that manages the electricity system overall, has recognised that they've built this very restrictive, very centralised model, and it's quite hard for people to do new things. And so what a regulatory sandbox means is they're actually looking at how they can create a space within the rules for people to do things that are a bit different. And we're talking about things like tariffs, consumer protection, network, what you're allowed to connect to the network, how you pay for use of the network, how you sell electricity, how you buy electricity off people. So creating an environment which kind of lets people do new things in a physically limited and time limited way, still has some consumer protections, but tries out new things. And that's at the stage of some recommendations having been made to change the rules. The rules haven't actually been changed yet, but there is that prospect there of, you know, if you've got a project where you've got something really fantastic that you want to do, but the rules don't let you do it for one reason or another, there is the possibility there of applying some flexibility. The other interesting development that's just happened in the last few months is the recognition that standalone power systems, the rules have made it quite hard to do standalone power systems at the edge of the grid, even though everybody agrees that that's a lot of ways financially where it makes most sense. There are a lot of locations where a very long power line, sometimes, you know, tens or hundreds of kilometres long, might serve 4 or 5 customers. The cost to the system of maintaining those poles and wires, and ironically, it's mainly the vegetation clearance that's the expense rather than the wires, but the cost of maintaining that infrastructure is much greater than just putting in standalone power supplies, whatever that is, solar panels and batteries, you know, maybe an emergency generator. Unfortunately, this particular initiative is about letting the distribution networks do that rather than letting individual customers do it. I mean, obviously an individual customer can go off the grid, but that doesn't solve the problem if there are other customers on the grid, and it doesn't allow a community to say, you know, we would rather have these 5 properties, you know, hooked up to a local power grid rather than have this power line that goes for 100 kilometres that serves a few customers. And the ENA Open Energy Networks project, once again, a recognition that the network is changing, that distributed resources are playing a much bigger role and will play a much bigger role in the electricity system in the future. This project, like all of these three examples that I've given, there are the people who will benefit from it most are a lot of the existing incumbents because they've got the scale and the money and the political clout to do these things, but they are also openings for the community sector to look at. I just want to finish on a couple of tensions or a couple of differences in the perception of where we're headed. So a lot of the media and discussion, quite sensibly, because of the climate crisis and the climate emergency, is about fossil fuels versus renewables. But there is also the vision of what the renewables looks like. And I think there is a lot of tension here between the large-scale projects, just here in Tasmania, for example. You know, you have the government saying 200% renewable electricity, but their perception of that is very much big projects, big wind farms, big interconnector to Victoria, big hydrogen projects. Whereas the community sector would be arguing for a more decentralised, a more democratic kind of process. So I think we need to fight both of those fights in a sense. You know, obviously the climate emergency makes doing anything you can to reduce carbon emissions, of which electricity is only one part, really important. But at the same time, there is that tension about what the systems of the future look like. So I think that is it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for Jack. That was really interesting. I'll start off with a couple of questions that came through early, and they were about slides or projects that you talked about. One, Greg in Darwin wanted to know about the Headsticks solar system, whether it was a 30 kilowatt inverter or was 30 kilowatts of rooftop modules. I'm not sure. Can you get a 30 kilowatt inverter?
Not easily, no. It is a three-phase inverter. It is a three-phase system, but it's standard 30 kilowatt, 250 watt panels. Yeah.
Okay. Catherine want to know more about the Newbina system, whether it's just 5 units that get backup power or whether it goes to a larger part of the community. I think it goes to a larger community, doesn't it?
No. The initial project is just for those 5 residential units. So yeah, they'll have a single point of connection to the grid, and if that goes down, the batteries will kick in seamlessly, and so some circuits in the houses will stop functioning, so that basically the hot water and the air conditioning, the space heating. But yeah, it's only those 5 units. As part of the wider project, we looked at doing a range of scales. So interestingly, that those 5 residential units are in an area that is, we've looked at doing a microgrid for a number of buildings in that area, because right next to those 5 new residential units, there's the fire station, the SES, an aged care facility, and some other residential units. So that's a bit of a congregation point in an emergency. So we have looked at and worked with Tas Networks on the possibilities of doing something at that, basically that transformer that services that area. And so we've got some rough scoping of how that might work, but the funded project is the 5 units.
Okay, you've sort of answered this one, but it's Narlan. He's heard that most of Tasmania's energy is already renewable. So does this mean that better environmental returns will be achieved by investing, energy saving building, EVs, etc., versus local solar power? I could point out that Tasmania also has the Basslink interconnector, so it becomes a financial thing, whether it's cheaper for us to buy coal-fired power from Victoria or to sell our hydro power to Victoria, and that there are times when we've made up to 40% of our power coming from Victoria. But I'll let Jack can go with the rest of it.
Yeah, so there are 2 quite different issues there. There's the economics. As Anne explained, Basslink the existing Basslink flows in both directions, and it often varies a couple of times a day, and that is very much driven by prices largely by prices. So when the wholesale price in Victoria is higher than the Tasmanian price, then hydro makes money selling electricity, and likewise coming back the other way. When Victorian electricity is cheaper, we buy it, which saves us which lets us keep water in the dams for later. And it's very weather dependent. So in a good year, we're net exporters. In a low rainfall year, we're net importers. We've had a couple of good years, so we have actually been a net exporter. But the other point that was in that question, which is really important, is yes, I'm passionate about community renewable energy projects. They're about electricity. But yes, if you're looking at carbon footprint, the number one issue in Tasmania is forestry policy. And, you know, the government's kind of having it both ways, saying they want to support the forestry industry, but also they're claiming the credits of the land use calculations that show that that's absorbing carbon, and that kind of hides the fact that we have substantial emissions from other areas, and that they are creeping up like everywhere else. So yes, in terms of carbon footprint for Tasmania, the number one priority is forestry policy, absolutely. And if you're transitioning to a sustainable society, then certainly there is more to do, I think, in the transport sector, electric vehicles, electric public transport, and in the industrial sector.
Okay, Fiona is looking to build a mixed housing development around 62 to 3-bedroom units in Campbelltown, which is in northern Tasmania, rural Tasmania, and looking to incorporate solar energy either individually or via a microgrid. Where should they start?
Well, by talking to me about what we've learned about the complexities of doing microgrids, very complicated regulatory environment. But yeah, so, and it depends very much. If it's a strata title or a individual owner, so I mean the Newbina Project, all of the buildings, the land and the buildings, funded by the state government but owned by or managed by the local government, so they're on one title. So you can do a single point of connection, and you can do that in a strata title development. But if you're doing a subdivision where you're dividing up blocks of land, then the national rules would prevent you from sharing electricity between those, or make it quite constrained in the way that you can share electricity between those different properties once they're separate properties. If they are strata titles and there is a body corporate, then there is the possibility of doing something. Probably worth a quick point about blended economics. So there is no doubt that solar panels have a far better return than batteries. So batteries are quite line ball, but because if you do the two together, the project can stack up. And some people will say that's great, and other people will say, oh, the solar panels are just subsidising the batteries. Really, you just should do the solar panels if you're trying to save money. The Newbina Project, particularly, we're looking at emergency power. So if you've got other reasons to do the batteries, then that's an advantage. But there is no doubt that on a pure economic basis, just bunging solar panels on the roof is the way to save money.
Okay, we've got Greg Knight in Wollongong. He's looking for a system of suburb scale batteries, 2 megawatt hours, distributed throughout the area, supplied by resident-owned large solar panels with a population of 300,000. They're looking for council to lead the PPA for a management company who may not own the batteries. Any suggestions?
No.
These are getting tricky, aren't they?
That's beyond my pay grade. But yes, you obviously need to talk to the distribution. I don't know who the distribution network is in Wollongong, but it'll probably be a privately owned distribution company, which probably makes it a little bit harder. There are certainly community scale batteries, and distribution networks are interested in them, and in some cases are investing in them. So yeah, there are some impressive community scale battery projects. I think really the ones that I'm aware of so far are funded by the economics of it's cheaper to put a battery in than to upgrade the line. So if you're looking for somebody else to generate the electricity with PV and put it into those batteries, yeah, maybe this is where the regulatory sandbox comes in, but you'd really need a lot of coordination between the network provider and the community group and the people who are going to invest in it.
Okay, here's one that's slightly out of left field. Cheryl Backhouse wants to know, how do you stop birds from perching on the Lismore floating pond panels? Maybe you could do what they do on yachts, put the net over the top, but that stops the sun as well.
No, I have no idea. No, yes, they're not going to self-clean the way a good solar panel with a slope on it does. So yes, maybe I don't know if anybody from Lismore is online, but I have no idea.
Di LF would like to know if any other Tasmania communities have come forward to talk about developing a CRE.
So I guess it's important to distinguish between on and off grid. So it's interesting that despite some quite serious research by people at UTAS, nobody really knows how many off-grid solar residences or community projects. I mean, I guess we know about the community scale ones because there's only a couple of them. But people who do, live in the remote parts of Tasmania and go off-grid do it for a bunch of reasons, which means they're not necessarily going to be, sort of saying, here I am and this is what I'm doing. So we don't really know the scale of off-grid. There's a bunch of interesting possible projects around Tasmania. My favourite is the Duck Reach Power Station in Launceston, but that's been driven largely by the council rather than by a community group. So yeah, there's a lot of other sustainability groups around, and the South Hobart, as Di will be aware, the South Hobart community's done bulk buys in the past, but yeah, not a lot of for some of those reasons that I outlined, not a lot of other projects. I don't know how it compares on a per capita basis, but certainly there's interest, but there's not I'm not aware of any groups working specifically on community renewable energy projects rather than either bulk buys or general sustainability initiatives.
Okay, here's a tricky one from Rick. Any technical possibility that in Tasmania that rooftop solar may be shut out to stop destabilising the grid in a similar way to the what AEMO did in the case of South Australia?
So that Open Energy Networks project that I provided a link to, the cynics would say that is about controlling solar. And people have different opinions on this. I think that there is an argument that in certain circumstances, the network operators ought to be able to throttle back solar. The question is whether they actually need to have the on-off switch, whether they need to be able to turn things on and off, which is what engineers like to do, or whether you can give the customers more autonomy, but give them a price signal or a technical specification that says, if we really can't, if it really will destabilise the grid, then at peak times we may need to throttle back the solar. So look, my dealings with Tas Networks, they're certainly, when they're reviewing the guidelines for that at the moment, there will be new guidelines that come into effect from the 1st of July this year on what you can connect. There will be, it won't actually change the limit. There was some talk of them reducing the limit from of what you could export to the grid, reducing that from 10 kilowatts to 5 kilowatts. As a result of lobbying that we did, they're keeping that at 10 kilowatts, but they are reserving the right to look at the particular location and maybe say in certain locations when we're going to not let you export that much to the grid. So it's a live issue. We've argued it a lot because you have different areas of interest here. So the network is mainly, network operators are concerned about the stability of the network. So, but they're not concerned about carbon abatement or Tasmania being 100, 110 or 150% renewable. I think there are ways that we can push more, make it easier for solar to get back into the grid. It does require some engineering of the grid, but the networks are naturally enough concerned about that.
Okay, as I was throwing us a whole lot of acronyms. How can we receive investment for CRE without having to pay for a costly AFSL? I'm sorry, I don't know what an AFSL is.
Australian Financial Services License.
Aha, thank
Um,
you.
yeah, so yes, so the quick answer is yes, by all means, do not get yourself into a situation where you have to be raising money from the public the way a public company does, or an investment scheme does. And how do you do that? Co-ops are far and away the easiest way to do that. So there is now a national co-op framework and co-op. There are still requirements. You still have to do a disclosure statement, but you don't have to do the full financial services kind of a thing that you would do if you were selling shares to the public. The other way of doing it, which is what they did with the Lismore Solar Farm, was they had a if you keep it to under 20 investors and they are what's legally called sophisticated investors, then once again you can accept money. So yeah, there are workarounds. I mean, donations is different, but when you're looking for investment, you do have to be careful that you don't, yeah, because you know, people talk about figures of a couple of $100,000 of legal fees to do the paperwork necessary to put out a prospectus. You're not going to do that for a community renewable energy project. So the short answers are co-op or private investment or donation.
Okay, thank you. Cal wants to know whether you can see a potential for ocean or wave energy, I guess, in Tasmania.
Not so sure about wave energy. Tidal energy, certainly, I am told that there is a bit between Flinders Island and the mainland of Tasmania, which is one of the 4 or 5 best tidal resources in Australia. Tidal power is interesting because it's much more predictable than wave power. So waves come and go, whereas the tides are obviously extremely predictable and are flowing most of the time. There's only a couple of hours each day where the tide reverses. I'm not an expert on it. They are usually, you know, $1 million projects, so they're outside the scope, and it hasn't reached the level of standard technology like, you know, wind and hydro and solar has. So Tasmania's certainly got good prospects, and there are people who've been looking at those prospects up in between the Bass Strait Islands and the northeast tip of Tasmania. I mean, it's a dreadful environment for technology. Salt water is nasty stuff. So a lot of the projects have had, you know, have had troubles. So it's been hard to, yeah. In theory, it's a huge amount of energy, and it's a very reliable amount of energy, but it hasn't hit mainstream in terms of cost effectiveness or proven technology.
Okay, Kerry, would you like you to explain what a microgrid is?
Okay, so yeah, a couple of different terms here. So a microgrid is, so it's a grid, so it's connected, certainly connecting a group of consumers together, and typically also some generation or some storage. So the way I use microgrid, the way it's usually used, is that grid can operate independently of the main grid. So it might be an off-grid microgrid. In other words, it's a local network that doesn't connect to the main grid, or it can be like the Newbina Project, where it does connect to the main grid most of the time, but it can operate without the main grid. So when the grid goes down, when the power's off, there is a related term, embedded network, which means, and that's more of a regulatory environment. And this is very common in, say, shopping centres, retirement villages, caravan parks. So there is some measurement and selling of electricity within a grid, but there's not necessarily the ability for it to run on its own. So yeah, short answer, microgrid means it can do its thing without the main grid operating for at least a short period of time.
Okay, and we're down to the last question. How about that?
Wow.
We've got Emily Webb would like to know, do you know of any hydrogen projects in the pipeline for Tasmania? Certainly there's the government idea of having one up at Bell Bay and another one at Burnie, but maybe you know more.
No, I don't know more. I think it's all pretty speculative. There's a lot of enthusiasm for hydrogen in the, state and federal governments. Um, I'm a little bit skeptical about a lot of it, and I particularly would say that I think that hydrogen is a really bad way of storing energy. Storing electricity. It's a good way of, it's an interesting way of storing energy. But if you use renewable energy to make hydrogen and then use that hydrogen to burn to make electricity, that's a really wasteful process, and I can't see the economics of that ever working. The hydrogen projects that I think are more likely to be viable are either heavy transport. Some people argue, and you'll get different views on this, some people argue that heavy transport is better, the hydrogen is better than batteries for heavy transport. But I think probably the industrial processes, I mean, particularly the fertiliser production, because that's a very mature technology. It already uses a lot of hydrogen, and ammonia is a way of storing energy as well. So I think, transport and industrial processes, particularly fertilisers, are the most likely. But no, I don't think anybody's got very far with, practical projects in Tasmania. It's all pretty, or anywhere. And there's a bit of a gold rush mentality. There's a bit of a, there was a report which claimed that Japan and Korea were going to buy huge amounts of renewable hydrogen in a few years' time, and that there was this gold rush to be the supplier. But when you look into it in a bit more detail, that's broad brush policy statements by the South Korean and Japanese government, and it's not a market that you'd necessarily invest on.
The proposal I saw, the government one, they were basically going to take atmospheric nitrogen and make ammonia out of it, and then export ammonia. But it was also going to need 4,000 megalitres of fresh water, which was a bit of a concern, especially up at Bell Bay, where you're quite a long way from anywhere with a lot of water.
Right.
That policy was put out in last November, I think. But we've also got a couple more here. Narlan's back again, outside the scope of this presentation, but he hears that the argument against electric vehicles, it's better to buy an old second-hand car versus a new electric car due to the energy and resources that go into new EVs versus the sunk energy costs in an existing car, even for accounting for ongoing emissions. So,
yeah, no, outside my area of expertise, but and yes, I'm sympathetic to the argument that you shouldn't necessarily go out and buy new things all the time.
Exactly. But when I went looking for a car a couple of years ago, all the EVs that were for sale secondhand were all at the end of their battery life.
Right. Yeah. No. Yes, you can have your cake and eat it a bit here now. That in Tasmania there are people importing used electric vehicles. So
the Good Car Company.
Yeah.
Just leaves me to thank Jack very much for a very interesting presentation. It's left us a lot of food for thought. And I hope you can sort of hear all the virtual clapping in the background with everybody saying thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Doug, and thanks everybody.